quite a sight. 200 years ago, on a dismal, cold, rainy night, the explosions here were real. The soldiers scared to death, and certainly not celebrating the colorful flashes of lights over their heads.
Hi, my name is Phil Marshall. I'm a filmmaker, and I'm going to tell you a simple story of a song and of the complex man who wrote it. The man is a reflection of his time, a child of the Revolution who became a famous, influential, and powerful constitutional lawyer, and is yet remembered, if at all, only as the author of America's national anthem. This is the story of Francis Scott Key and the song that built America.
This program is made possible by Delaplane Foundation Incorporated of Frederick, Maryland, and by Mike and Marlene Young, George and Betty Delaplane, and production support provided by Shutter Punch Visual Effects.
We hear this song all the time, but what do we really know about it? The song, written by Francis Scott Key in September 1814, did not become our national anthem until 1931. But the story of Frank Key and his song starts a number of years before Mr. Key was born.
To Anacreon in heaven, where he sat in full glee, a few sons of harmony sent a petition that he their inspirer and patron would be, when this answer arrived from that jolly old Grecian.
The Anacreonic Society was one of many gentlemen's clubs, and their purpose was convivial, to get together, to enjoy each other's company, to eat, to drink. And in many of these clubs, music was a central activity.
Done were to love Venus with Bacchus's vine.
The song only makes sense if you know a little bit about the namesake of the club, Anacreon, who was a real living person in 5th century BC Athens. He was a poet, a musician. And his poems and songs were rediscovered earlier in the 18th century and circulated. And they were all rather risque. They're about love and wine and hedonistic activities.
Flute, no longer be mute. I'll lend you my name and inspire you to boot.
John Stafford Smith was a very famous organist. Smith was invited to compose music to go with Rafe Tomlinson's poem. He probably wasn't a member of the society.
I'll instruct you like me to entwine. Done were to love Venus with Bacchus's vine.
So the story begins on either side of the ocean at about the same time.
They were indeed children of the Revolution. They had grown up shortly after the Revolution. They would have been influenced by the ideology, very much affected by this grand experience that the American people had in launching their nation.
This lovely country home is the site where Francis Scott Key was born. It's called Terra Rubra, Latin for red earth, and today it is still a working farm. Life for Frank and his sister was that of privilege and aristocracy. It may have been a bit primitive here then, but their lifestyle was as good as it got for country folk in America in those days. John Ross Key, their father, was a lawyer and local magistrate. Their family at the low end of the upper class. Books and even libraries were in Frederick at the time, but the Bible became a kind of weight that Frank's elders pressed into his soul, especially in his early life.
They had religious ceremonies at Terra Rubra, I know that, and they were pretty strictly religious. I didn't see that much of a difference of him coming here. I think it's a constant throughout his life.
Christianity formed an important foundation as he read the Bible and memorized many of the scriptures, and thus cemented his pious reputation.
If the Bible was his principal reading material, then he was probably living within a fairly insular subculture within the larger culture of Baltimore, which was quite heterogeneous and not as deeply religious as the Puritans in Massachusetts or even the Quakers in Philadelphia.
This is where Francis Scott Key was educated, St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. Founded in 1696, it's still open for business today and has a different and unique curriculum. But Francis Scott Key's presence is still all around.
This college was bringing in students at young ages, so it had a grammar school. And Francis Scott Key entered on the very day this college opened. So he was among the first students to attend the school, but at age 10. Most people don't think of a college student being as young as that. He stayed for 7 years and not only completed all of the requirements of the grammar school, which included a mastery of Latin and Greek and surveying and navigation and various useful arts, but he then prepared himself for a full 4-year study of college.
St. John's is more than 75 miles from Terra Rubra, just an hour by car today. But it would have taken Frank more than 15 hours in a stagecoach to reach home.
This elaborate place is the Upton Scott House, looking pretty much as it did in Frank's time. It's where he stayed during his school years. The good Dr. Scott's wife, Elizabeth, was Frank's great aunt. Frank would often stand on that landing there and read scripture to his great uncle and aunt and their guests in this wonderful home. His aunt and older cousin, Eugenia, would dote over him. They dressed and trimmed his hair in frocks more suitable to a young lady than a strapping country squire. It seemed that Frank enjoyed the attention, but it later became a problem for him.
That front lawn, which looks very much like it does today, was rented out to people to graze. And Francis Scott Key was fond, we're told, of riding on cows across the college green. So he'd escape from behind the fence and go out and enjoy his cow rides. But I don't know a 10 to 12-year-old boy who isn't trying to prove his manliness.
The Upton Scotts treated young Frank well. However, these relatives are a complication in Frank's story that's not much spoken of today. It's one of the great many paradoxes of Francis Scott Key.
There were lots of loyalists in Annapolis. There were very few in Baltimore, and probably even fewer in Frederick.
The great-uncle and the uncle both were loyalists to England. So that couldn't have not had an influence on Frank's thinking about England.
And so enter his uncle, Philip Barton Key. We've got to step back a bit to understand Philip Barton.
During the War of Independence, Philip gave up what would have been a significant inheritance and fought as a captain in the British Army for 4 years until he was captured by the Americans. At the end of the war, he traveled to England and studied law at Middle Temple.
The first thing Philip did when returning to Maryland was to meet and marry the beautiful and rich Ann Platter, the daughter of the former governor and well-known politician George Platter. By 1794, Philip was a member of the Maryland House of Delegates. He had become the only loyalist to resurrect his Tory reputation, and it was the beginning of an impressive career.
Uncle Philip Barton Key had much bigger influence over Frank's life than his father did.
So it was payback time for Uncle Philip. He was about to enter law practice with Jeremiah Chase and had arranged for Frank to read law in his office. We're not sure exactly where that was, but it may have been right here.
There was no such thing as law school in Frank's time. Reading and studying law in an established office was how you became a lawyer.
Frank wasn't the only one reading law in Jeremiah Chase's law offices. It was there he first met, then studied many an hour with the brilliant young Roger B. Taney.
Later in life, with Frank's help, Roger would become Chief Justice of the United States, and much later after that, decide the Dred Scott case, said to have ignited the Civil War.
Roger Taney was a Catholic, but he and his family were staunch Federalists. This probably helped his acceptance into the Key household, which would become important as Roger fell in love and married Frank's sister, Anne. These are a few copies of Frank Key's poems from the collection at the Maryland Historical Society. They're love poems to some girl named Delia. They get quite erotic at times, but these others are more subdued and tame, and they're written to Frank's wife-to-be, Mary Taylor Lloyd. My fantasy of researching a story like this is to ask someone like Mary Key, what's up? But we'd have to suspend belief for that. We'd have to think that you could really see Mary Taylor Lloyd Key, say, sitting in that rocker over there.
I understand that you want to ask me some questions.
Yes. Where do I begin? I found some love poems Frank wrote to someone named Delia. Do you know who she is?
I've seen the poems. I don't know who she was, but he wrote them to her the summer before we met. He had started his law practice in Frederick, and she was some local girl up here. That's all I know. Anything else?
Oh, yes, very much more, but let me get right back to you. So, this is Pipe Creek. It's just down the road from Terra Rubra. Somewhere around here, probably in a patch just like this, Frank pitched and wooed his Delia. Get this. Long had a golden key concealed, the treasures of my Delia's breast. Treasures one half so sweet and rich, sure never key before possessed. But ah, that little golden key, could I dare unlock its store, and with the trembling hand of love, whose treasures long concealed explore. Who was this girl, anyway? So if we suppose that Frank was really in love with this girl Delia, whoever she was, and his father told him to drop her in no uncertain terms, he probably would have been pretty angry in a 19th century controlled kind of way. But I'm just supposing. As pious as Frank's reputation is, you wouldn't think that he liked to knock back a few. But he loved the drink. And it's possible he would have been drowning his sorrow over the beautiful young Delia in a place like this. There was one particular tune of a non-religious nature that was making the rounds. That summer, John Adams was campaigning for his second term, and Frank most certainly would have heard the music by then, which would stick in his head and guide his destiny.
What's unique about the melody that Stafford Smith composed for the Anacreontic Society is that it was a really good tune, and the tune caught on. So while the original publication was Stafford's tune with Rafe Tomlinson's poem combined, as it spread and over to our side of the ocean as well, people started to play around with the tune and write new words to it.
While the earth bears a planter, the sea rolls its waves, and ne'er may the sons of Columbia be slaves. While the earth bears a planter, the sea rolls its waves.
Well, as you can gather, it was the Anacreonic tune he couldn't stop humming. So as the John Adams campaign song was sung in taverns like this, I speculate that the current political campaign may have sparked an idea for Frank, an idea for rebellion against his father's outright rejection of his first true love, Delia.
I don't really remember why Frank decided to go against his father's political beliefs and campaign for Thomas Jefferson. But if he had not done so, it's possible we may never have met and married.
So here's how I speculate this all went down. Frank maybe wants to campaign for Thomas Jefferson to protest against his father. Frank's old school chum, Daniel Murray, was dating Mary Taylor Lloyd, who just happened to be the sister-in-law of Joseph Hopper Nicholson, who happened to be Thomas Jefferson's campaign manager. So tell me about how you first met Frank.
Well, my father had died when I was 12, and my brother, Edward Lloyd, the fifth in a line of Edwards, took over the family plantation near Easton at the tender age of 17. I was residing in our family home in Annapolis and was actually more interested in Frank's former schoolmate, Daniel Murray, at the time.
I'm betting it was Daniel who introduced them just before he began his naval career. By the way, that's the Lloyd family Annapolis digs, and probably where they were introduced. This was lucky for Frank, for when this frustrated romantic met Mary Taylor Lloyd, he fell head over heels in love with her. She also just happened to be the most eligible bachelorette in all of Maryland, if not America at the time. Her family was loaded.
After Daniel had gone off to sea, I began somehow to see more of Frank. He would show up with these insipid love ballads. I remember telling him to not stop writing them, as I could make good use of the paper he wrote his poems on to curl my hair. I was so mean to him. Frank was persistent in his attentions to me. We married in January 1802, much to my brother Edward's objections.
He would visit you in Annapolis.
And Baltimore as well. I would occasionally stay with one of my two sisters who lived there.
Didn't he have a law practice in Frederick by now? It's some distance away.
Well, he didn't have many clients. And you see, he had business with my brother-in-law, as they were both interested in Mr. Jefferson's politics and his election to the presidency.
Mrs. Key, Polly, can I call you Polly?
If you must.
Can you tell me more about your children?
We traveled to Y to birth Elizabeth, our first child. It was the October following our marriage. Our second child, Mariah, was born about 2 years later at my sister's home, the Woodyard, near Upper Marlboro.
This is the site today of the former Woodyard Plantation. Built in 1683, it was purchased by Stephen West and later taken over by his son Richard, who married Polly's other sister. Their brick home here, unfortunately, burned down after the Civil War. But this is where Frank and Polly probably had their second baby girl.
Woodyard was a beautiful place. I remember Frank's cousin Sarah and her husband, Dr. Beans, came by as well. It was so wonderful to have so many relatives around at such a joyful time.
Pardon me, do you mean Dr. William Beans, the man Frank saved from the British, the reason behind why he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner?
Of course.
Okay, I'm jumping ahead of a bit here, but the reason Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner is that he witnessed the British attack on Baltimore. He was there because he had gone way out of his way to try and help Dr. William Beans. He's a former resident of Upper Marlboro. Now, I always wondered why Frank would suddenly risk his life for this old guy. There's very little information about it, but I dug in and found out that it was all in the family. Dr. Beans' wife was a second cousin of Frank's by marriage. These family connections are amazing. Genealogy records seem to show that Frank had 12 children. Did a child die?
4 of our children died, 3 in Frank's lifetime. But we had only 11 children, I assure you.
I don't mean to upset you, but I keep coming across a reference to a 12th child named Caroline Key, said to be born in 1830.
I don't know where you got that information. She wasn't my child.
We better just leave that alone. So while Polly was busy having children, 11, and Frank was scrambling to build his career, his old Uncle Philip would again influence his life. Philip had bought this land to build that place called Woodley. It seems the old Tory was making quite a reputation in Washington. Uncle Philip had political aspirations and asked his protege nephew to move to Washington and help him out with his law practice. It was just what young Frank was looking for. He'd be right in the middle of all the action in Washington. So he's delighted to oblige and leased a home near here in 1804. Now that the eager young lawyer and his growing family were here in Washington, he strived to make his mark. Thomas Jefferson and his foreign policy would become another catalyst.
The Barbary regencies on the North African coast typically shook down the great powers. They received tribute from the great powers in order not to interfere with their trade. As long as our ships flew the British flag prior to the Revolution, we were protected. But once we ran up the American flag, we no longer enjoyed that protection, and they started targeting our ships. We paid tribute until 1801, when Jefferson sent a fleet to the Mediterranean in order to assert our sovereignty as an independent nation and protect our trade in the Mediterranean. One of our frigates, the Philadelphia, had ran aground and had been taken over by the Tripolitans, and Decatur took part in an expedition to board that ship one night and burn it so that it did not remain in the hands of the Tripolitans.
Frank had somehow weaseled an invitation to a presidentially hosted victory dinner for Captain Stephen Decatur in that building right there. It's said that with less than an hour's notice, he grasped the opportunity and composed a song using that familiar tune stuck in his head. A song to honor the captain and make his presence known to all of official Washington. Unfortunately, he apparently sung it himself, and it's probably how he got the reputation of being tone deaf.
In the conflict resistless each toil they endured, till their foes fled dismayed from the war's desolation, and pale beamed the crescent, its splendor obscured by the light of the star-spangled flag of our nation.
Sound familiar? He titled his song When the Warrior Returned.
The Anacreontic song was parodied dozens, in fact scores, perhaps even more than 100 times in America. The most significant of which when Francis Scott Key writes his first parody.
And the turbaned heads bowed to its terrible glare.
There were over 100 ladies and gentlemen sitting at long tables festooned with fashions of the day, their goblets filled with wine. A host of black servants served a variety of fine foods to the president and other dignitaries, including one John Randolph of Roanoke.
Randolph was a wealthy, young, brilliant, and very eccentric congressman from Virginia, and a second cousin to Thomas Jefferson. He was not impressed with Frank or his song, possibly because listening to Frank's voice was torture.
For the brows of the brave.
But Mr. Randolph's next encounter with Francis Scott Key would make him change his mind, and it would change both their lives forever.
One example of Burr's thwarted ambition was his attempt, after having been defeated for the presidency, defeated as governor of New York, to create his own country in the southwestern United States with the support of either the Spanish or the British.
The president charged Mr. Burr and others, including Frank's clients, Mr. Bowman and Swarthout, with treason. Jefferson had suspended the writ of habeas corpus with a justification of preventing terrorism.
Frank became embroiled in that court case. It made him a famous and sought-after solicitor in the district.
So what was it about from your perspective?
Power. And vengeance.
No affidavits here show any act of treason or assemblage of men, nor military array. There is not one tittle of evidence.
John Randolph had witnessed Frank's oration in the lower courts and was duly impressed. It was his encouragement that convinced Frank and the other defense lawyers to proceed with their arguments all the way to the Supreme Court.
Frank's legal skills helped to win his case and his client's freedom. And Frank's arguments influenced Mr. Burr's trial a month later.
Did John Randolph like the outcome?
He couldn't have been happier. The whole thing ended in a very close friendship for them. And Frank became instantly famous in legal circles in Washington. Our future seemed secure. For a little while.
Unlike many other American wars, this is a war of aggression. We started it. We invaded Canada.
The war you did begin, Jim, and why did you do so? You could have found some better ground, James Madison, my Joe.
Just weeks after the vote for war, that horrible violence broke out in Baltimore.
Well, how did it start?
Mr. Hansen published his opinions against the war in his newspaper and was accused of being a traitor.
So the Federalists were against the war. Who were the rioters then?
The rioters were those horrible immigrants in Baltimore City, Irishmen and other dirty Europeans. They supported the Democratic Republicans and Thomas Jefferson's ideals. The riots were the first thing to bring the horrors of that war directly into our lives.
So you and Frank had a connection to those events?
We were very close to two of the defenders that were there.
Defenders?
Defenders of the Constitution. They, like us, truly believed in freedom of the press.
The day after Congress declared war on Great Britain, Alexander Conti Hansen blasted President Madison in his newspaper. He claimed Madison went to war to fight the mightiest naval power on earth without adequate funding, taxes, troops, ships, or fortifications. This may have all been true, but most of the good citizens of Baltimore did not want to hear it. On June 22nd, 1812, a pro-war mob stormed Hansen's newspaper offices somewhere close to this spot. They smashed his presses and threw them onto the street, along with paper stock, type, and anything else they could lay their hands on. Then they burned the building down. But it didn't end there.
Hansen himself fled the city, but only went as far as Georgetown, from which he continued to publish his paper and continued to inflame local sentiment in Baltimore. The mob took on an existence of its own and went on a rampage every night.
Gangs of New York kind of thing.
That's right, maybe even worse.
On July 26, 1812, there were large brick homes lining this street. Only that night, it was like a scene from a Martin Scorsese movie. About 5 weeks after the mob destroyed his newspaper, Hansen began printing up a new batch of papers in a building located right about there.
And then just to top things off, right on the masthead of the paper, Hansen printed the address of the building that it was being published from. By dusk, a mob had gathered outside the building, throwing rocks.
Hansen and his group were held up in the house with hundreds of rioters beginning to surround him. But he was still cocky about it. And someone from his camp fired a shot in the air. But that was like waving a red flag at a bull.
Fire again! Fire again! Fire again!
A number of historians have pointed to this as the incident of civil disorder that sort of changed the rules of rioting in the United States.
Major William B. Barney, son of Commodore Barney, whom we'll learn about later, arrived on horseback with a contingent of about 30 men.
Gentlemen, disperse, all of you. Go home. Go to your homes, gentlemen. We'll take charge of these men and conduct them to the jail. Well, they'll await trial, as is the law of this land, not this mob action. Disperse, all of you. Go home.
Their only chance of survival was to allow themselves to be escorted to the city jail by the cavalry.
It was a little more than a half a mile to the jail located here. The mob had worked itself up into a real froth by now. The small squad was completely outnumbered and desperately alarmed.
The mob stormed into the building swinging swords, axes, clubs, and guns. Major Barney watched helplessly and made the sign of the cross.
Barney was particularly distraught by the grins and excitement of children clapping their hands with glee.
I watched the mob pull 8 or 9 of the defenders out into the square. The monsters descended on those men like locusts. General Lincoln staggered to his feet and spoke.
Merciful God, I was with Washington. I was a prisoner of the British. I'm no Tory.
He was beaten down by a member of the mob, but stood up again.
I'm holding it firm. I have a family that needs my support.
And again he was assaulted, but his remarks began to attract much of the mob's attention.
Please, please, gentlemen, have mercy on an old soldier.
Someone stamped his foot into the general's breast. Another knelt on him and punched his face in rapid succession.
This damned old rascal is the hardest dying of all of them.
Lincoln lasted only a few minutes after someone stabbed him in the chest with a bayonet. He expired without a groan.
Can you imagine how we felt? Daniel Murray, someone very close to Frank and I, and General Lincoln, a personal friend and client of Frank's. Frank had just prepared his will.
Did you agree with Frank's anti-war stance after that?
I'm not sure I want to speak of it.
You know, he was extremely against the War of 1812 before it started and right up until 1813 when the British started raiding up and down the Chesapeake Bay.
John Randolph of Roanoke was also vehemently opposed to the War of 1812. Randolph, in fact, lost his seat over it, but he stood in Congress daily and ranted on against it until his term ended. His personal connection to Frank would strengthen and continue through endless letters about a myriad of subjects.
I believe that a man who does not follow his own inclinations and choose his own ways, but is willing to do whatever may be appointed for him, will have his path of life chosen for him and shown to him.
We had a very poor military establishment. Upper echelons of the officer corps was staffed by political appointees and relics from the Revolution who had lost their taste for battle. Enlisted men were raw recruits. So we did very badly in 1812 and only did a little better in the West in 1813 after Perry's great victory on Lake Erie enabled Harrison to chase down a small British army and defeat it in Upper Canada. But that was about the only real durable success we enjoyed in the first 2 campaigns of the war.
By the time of Napoleon's first defeat in April 1813, the British were comfortably able to reallocate some resources to end the bothersome activity with their former colony. Business started to slow down in Washington, especially affecting a young lawyer with a growing family. Frank and Polly had their sixth child, Edward, the previous September. So right in the middle of it all, Frank began to consider leaving the law.
Money came in. He had it, but he had to bail his father out at one point and took a loan from his uncle, from Philip Barton Key, because something happened at Terra Rubra where his father was late on mortgage payments or whatever it was.
The Grand Poobah of the Episcopal Church at the time, Bishop Kemp, had been trying to convince Frank to become a minister. Frank was a pious man, very pious by some accounts, but not so pious as to not realize that his life, full of complications, debt, and a growing family, would not be made any easier with a very low-paying ministry post. So by the end of April, he turned the bishop down and struggled along as events began to envelop Washington and Baltimore's fate. The British had made their headquarters for Chesapeake operations at Tanger Island, at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. It was there that British Major General Robert Ross and 2,500 redcoats, fresh from their successful Napoleonic War experiences, arrived from England via Bermuda. This would not be good news for Francis Scott Key and his compatriots.
We were all so afraid of the attack. There were all these terrible stories about the British.
Did he continue to oppose the war after that?
Oh, yes. And he did it publicly. He spoke to a group in Alexandria at a celebration of George Washington's birthday.
Were there any repercussions from the speech?
Thank goodness, no.
In June 1814, it was right around a place like this that Frank and his fellow militia rushed up and spotted a British frigate sailing downriver. They had thought their presence had driven off the British, and within 2 weeks, Frank returned home and sent for Polly. The British, however, were only in preparation for events to come.
Frank realized the war had changed, and supporting it now was necessary as a matter of defense to protect our own home and family. He even joined the militia. It's still hard to imagine it all happening.
British Rear Admiral Coburn terrorized the residents of the Chesapeake and had been the architect of numerous attacks and encounters. Some may have been simple reconnaissance to map out all of the most vulnerable places to attack, but his eye was always on Washington. As it turns out, Washington, D.C. became a prime target, not because it was important militarily, but because of the PR damage an attack on the Capitol could cause us. So with a fresh group of crack troops, the British forces under Ross's command landed at Benedict, Maryland on August 19th, 1814. They marched up the peninsula and into Upper Marlboro here, and they were met with a white flag of truce by a group of citizens. Dr. William Beans was front and center holding the flag. That night, the officers ended up at a pretty handsome mansion house, probably located where that school is now. It was the home of Dr. William Beans and his wife, Sarah, who, as we mentioned, was Frank's second cousin by marriage. They drank the good doctor's wine, enjoyed his slaves' cooking, and went over their coming invasion plans.
And Ross, at that home, was deliberating whether or not to continue to Washington. He wasn't at all convinced that they should.
But it's just that they got close enough, and he was persuaded by Admiral Coburn and some of his own officers.
And Ross had been really unimpressed with what he'd seen in terms of American defenses to that point. And so that day, at that meeting, they decide to continue to Washington.
The Americans would meet the British at Bladensburg. A long column of British soldiers with scarlet tunics and shining bayonets advanced 6 abreast onto the field. Francis Scott Key watched the scene on horseback. At this point, he was a volunteer aide to General Walter Smith, the commander of the 1st Columbian Brigade. We suppose the general probably asked Frank to accompany him because he knew he had a good knowledge of the country and the Bladensburg area. The British stopped and made a line face-to-face with the Americans. General Ross yelled, "Fire!" A few volleys passed. Ross then called for the charge. The front ranks of the British, armed with bayonet, headed straight for the panic-stricken militia. The ill-trained American militia broke their lines and fled. Our artillery kept up resistance for a while and took out quite a few of the British.
But as they fell, other redcoats quickly closed the gap and continued to smash through the American line.
The British began to discharge a new kind of superweapon, the Congreve rocket. We'd never seen anything like it. What must Frank have been thinking as he first spotted the rocket's red glare and witnessed the hundreds of militiamen running away in fear?
Colonel William Congreve developed the British version of the weapon that was used in the Napoleonic Wars. But the rockets were pretty inaccurate and had a tendency for blowing up before they took off. They were as much a psychological weapon as a physical one, and probably caused more panic than damage.
It was not one of our better moments, but amongst the panic and confusion, there was one small group of fearless Americans who arrived near the end of the battle and began causing trouble for the advancing British. Frank may also have noticed those brave men and wondered about them as he was retreating with the other officers.
Well, Barney, at one point, as the British are more or less trying to regroup, orders some of the flotilla men and Marines to launch an attack as if they were boarding a ship, and they came running down with cutlasses, and this further stunned the British. Barney, they said, had given them the only real fight of the day.
But they continued to march.
The British sent in a white flag, drums and trumpets sound to call for a parley, and nobody was there. And then, in fact, shots rang out. Ross's horse was shot from underneath him, and several British soldiers were killed. And so that was seen as an act of war, and that's what led to the burning of Washington.
This is the original location of Congress in 1814. The British piled all the desks and anything not nailed down into the center of these chambers. Coburn ascended the rostrum and took the speaker's chair. It's said that he yelled,
"All in favor of setting fire to this harbor of Yankee democracy, say aye."
The vote, of course, was unanimous, and so they torched it. But the British invasion force seemed really quite controlled given Coburn's reputation. They only burned the National Library, State, War, and Treasury buildings, and of course, the White House. So the British were in Washington for 26 hours. If Coburn had his way, he would have led his troops immediately from Washington to Baltimore and attack it by land from the west. It was only 30 miles away and actually about the same distance as his ships back on the Potomac. If he had mounted that attack, we might be drinking a lot more tea around these parts, as the harbor defenses weren't ready and Baltimore was completely defenseless by land.
I was at Middlebrook Tavern outside the city, and the children were with their grandparents at Terra Rubra.
When did you next see Frank after the attack on Washington?
Shortly after. When I returned home, I found Frank in a strange and depressed mood. He said he heard the voice of God in the howling of the tempest. He mumbled that it was another visitation sent down by the God of wrath upon a wicked people. Frank said he looked upon General Ross and Admiral Coburn as instrumentalities of the deity, carrying out the divine plan of retribution. So unnerved was he that for several days afterwards he had neither time nor mind to do anything.
About 8 days after the attack, Frank's brother-in-law and client, Mr. Richard West, rode the 20 or so miles from Upper Marlboro to Georgetown in record time.
He tells Frank about poor old Dr. Beans being taken away by the British, then asks him to help save him. How could Frank say no to two relatives?
And he asks him to undertake a mission to persuade the British to release Beans. And Key agrees immediately to do that and gets permission from the Madison administration.
Dr. Beans arrested some British stragglers after the capture of Washington, as the British were on their way back to their vessel on the Patuxent. And so General Ross heard about this and sent a party back to Upper Marlboro and arrested Dr. Beans and several other men, and they were taken to the ships.
Mason wants Key to go on this mission with John Skinner, who was the American agent in charge of these direct negotiations with the prisoners.
Frank was 35 years old, and Colonel John Stuart Skinner, the American prisoner exchange officer, was only 26 when they met here at Fells Point and set out of Baltimore to find the British. I've wondered if that huge flag was flying at the fort when they left the city. They had a white flag of truce flying on their craft and a crew of 5 or 6. They sailed south for 2 full days. The attack on Baltimore was an on-again, off-again thing with the British. They hooked up with more arriving troops to ready for an Admiralty-ordered attack plan on New Orleans. But the new moon and high tides kept them from sailing out of the Chesapeake Bay, and they were stuck here. So with time on their hands, the British decided to make the attack on Baltimore. Imagine what that first encounter with the British fleet was like for Frank, appearing as it did through a dense fog. Francis Scott Key and Colonel Skinner couldn't have arrived at a more inopportune time that day. They climbed aboard the British flagship Tonnant just as they were making ready for attack. Skinner had already negotiated with Admiral Cockburn a number of times, and he noticed that his mind was on something else. But Frank, when arriving, immediately spoke to Cockburn. And he later told Roger Tawney that his plea for Dr. Beans was received so coldly that he feared it would fail. What the British were really peeved off about with Beans is the fact that he met them with a white flag in Marlborough and promised neutrality. The British couldn't stand that kind of hypocrisy.
Ross seems to have felt highly about the ideas of honor and chivalry.
Key and Skinner were invited for a meal with the officers. Vice Admiral Cochrane, General Ross, and Rear Admiral Cockburn, among others, were present. Skinner wrote in his diary,
"The wine flowed in free circulation. The conversation at first concerned some past dealings I had with them. General Ross sat silent for most of the meal, and I noticed an unhealed neck wound that he had probably received in France that past February."
Ross took Skinner aside and told him he would release Dr. Beans.
Yeah, nothing that Key or Skinner said really had anything to do with Ross's decision.
I will say that, you know, Beans and other Americans were put in a difficult position. I mean, it's like having an abusive parent.
But he's been very moved by the letters from his men that he's left behind.
So in the end, other than probably to help arrange the letters and documents to present to the British, which he did in advance, Francis Scott Key didn't need to be there at all. His famed eloquence was not tested, and no negotiations were necessary. But early the next morning, Key was informed that neither he nor anyone else would be permitted to leave the fleet for some days, until after the pending attack on Baltimore.
And so in the case of Baltimore, and I call that the battle for Baltimore, you had the naval engagement, which resulted in the bombardment of Fort McHenry, and then you had the land engagement, and that's where troops were landed at North Point, and their hope was to be able to take the city in a combined attack with the Navy.
Ross did not have the officers that he needed to lead the advance at Baltimore. So he was leading the advance himself. The British got into a skirmish.
Ross wants to see what the holdup is and bring up some reinforcements because it seems like it's a fairly significant American force up ahead. At this point, he's hit by a shot.
The local legend is that it was 2 boys of Asquith's rifles.
The debate over Ross is what killed him. Was it musket balls or rifle balls or artillery? And I don't think we know.
The entire city turned into a work camp with thousands of citizens helping build earthworks, and gun platforms were constructed and trenches dug, and pretty soon they had just miles of fortifications stretching all along Hempstead Hill.
Major General Samuel Smith, who's in charge of the city's defenses and the militia, had been working on those earthworks for months. So they're very stout defenses.
And so even though the British won the Battle of North Point, and they were able to march within a mile of the defenses on the east side of Baltimore, once they saw those heavily defended heights,
they could not break through those defenses without some help.
Key, Beans, and Skinner had been moved from the Tonnant to a smaller ship, the Surprise. But Colonel Skinner asked the British to return them to their own ship. He said it would be unbearable to witness the bombardment from a British ship. So they were placed back on board their little vessel with a few Marines, and their sails were hauled up to the Surprise.
The British Navy had 8 bomb ships worldwide at the time. 5 of those 8 ships were now anchored in the harbor, 2 short miles from Fort McHenry.
During the summer of 1813, a good year and a half before the battle, Armstead realizes as he gets the preparations made, they need more ammunition, they need more reinforcements. And then he also says there is no suitable ensign or flag to fly over the fort. And then he goes on to write, "It is my intention to have a flag so large the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance."
It was 6:30 in the morning on Tuesday, September 13th, 1814, when the Volcano began the bombardment. The British ships adjusted to their range and lofted one shot after another at the fort.
As one defender said, it sounded like thunder as the fort's cannons opened up. Armstead, you can sense his frustration. He orders more gunpowder shoved into the barrels, to try to eke out that range. So that sense is like he wants to get them.
The American guns kept firing, but their shots did nothing but kick up spots of water, falling well short of the British ships.
So reluctantly, the orders are passed down, ceasefire. So the guns fall silent.
He had small crews fire back occasionally to show the fort was not giving up.
The lack of fire from Fort McHenry scared Francis Scott Key, but he was comforted with each glimpse of the great flag still flying over the fort.
The exact location of Key's vessel has never been determined. It's possible it was moved over the course of the attack. It's believed that at least for part of the time, the little ship was up front, quite close to the bombardment. The British may have wanted them nearby to perhaps help negotiate the fort's surrender. You mentioned Frank had thought Washington earned its fate. What did he think about Baltimore?
He may have felt the same at first, but he showed me a letter that he wrote to Mr. Randolph after the battle. He recalled how the war was met with public rejoicing in Baltimore, and thus at first he thought they deserved what they were getting. But he went on to say he began thinking about the many faithful followers of God in Baltimore City, and thought their faith lessened their wickedness, and thus made him feel less fearful.
By 9:30 that morning, Cochrane had been pretty concerned by what he'd seen, particularly the ships that had been sunk in the harbor with the chains defending them. You could see gunboats behind that, the position of the batteries, and he realized he wasn't going to be able to sail past the fort without possibly losing his squadron. Just 3 hours after the bombardment begins, Cochrane writes a letter more or less saying that, I don't think the Royal Navy is going to be able to give you much support. So if you want to attack, you're probably going to have to do it on your own.
So imagine that. The commander of the British Naval Forces, Admiral Cochrane, knew this chess match was a draw by 9:30 a.m. that first morning. But Frank and the others didn't know that, and more importantly, neither did Admiral Coburn and his ground forces. It was not easy to get messages from ships-to-ground commanders.
In Napoleonic warfare, there's always that wild card, meaning that if you keep up the bombardment, you might get the lucky shot. So I think the British still recognized that there was a chance of winning because they kept the bombardment up.
By nightfall, Cochrane had devised a new plan. They would try a sneak attack near here. That's the entrance to the Fort McHenry Tunnel now, but back then this was a backup fortification called Battery Babcock. The attack here would be a diversion for the real ground attack at Hampstead Hill on the other side of town.
Admiral Cochrane has no idea whether or not the Army forces are going to continue with their attack on the American defenses. He sent this message 12 hours earlier, but he's received nothing in return. And to cover this attack, the British launched an enormous barrage at the fort.
Around midnight, the British began their mission. The night was so dark that some of their boats got lost, but about a third of the British force found a gap in the line of sunken hulls and slipped past Fort McHenry. The commander here at Battery Babcock was John Adams Webster. He knew something was up when he heard the splashing from the oars. The Americans aimed the guns and began to fire. As the men on the barges fired back, the British flagship sent a bright blue flare into the air.
The bomb ships suddenly began an even more fierce attack on the fort. This must have really frightened Frank. What did that blue flare mean? To them out here, it must have looked like the beginning of a land invasion.
Fire! One witness described it as the portals of hell opening up.
Frank told us that he, Mr. Skinner, and Dr. Beams stayed on deck all night and watched every shell from the moment it was fired till it fell. They listened with breathless interest to hear if an explosion followed. But as long as there was bombardment, it was sufficient proof to them that the fort had not surrendered.
At 3 a.m., the British troops are ordered to fall in, but they began marching away from Baltimore. Admiral Cochrane's note finally reached British commanders shortly before the attack on Battery Babcock began. If they attacked and failed, the blame would fall squarely on them.
People like to speculate what might have happened if Ross had not been killed, and we'll never know the answer to that. But what we do know is that at the Battle of Bladensburg, Ross was very aggressive. So what might have happened at North Point if he had not been killed?
The guns grew ominously silent in those early hours of the morning. Frank and the others had no idea what that meant. They paced the deck in painful suspense, waiting with intense anxiety for the return of the sun.
At dawn, the storm flag hung limp. They could not tell if it was British or American. A breeze lifted the small flag, but they were still too far away to see it clearly. At 9 a.m., the Fort McHenry garrison stood at attention, as they did every morning when the storm flag was lowered and the great banner was raised. This morning, however, the raising of that banner was something quite special.
Isaac Monroe said that the garrison cheered up on the ramparts as the British ships withdrew and as the flag was hoisted at 9 a.m. So clearly there was an additional meaning behind that, almost like thumbing your nose at the withdrawing British ships.
Frank would soon write to John Randolph,
"It seems to have given me a higher idea of the forbearance, long-suffering, and tender mercy of God than I had ever before conceived."
Frank's inspiration came in the fervor of the moment, as he saw the enemy hastily retreating to their ships. It was a natural impulse for this artistically inclined guy to make notes on the back of a letter. You may have heard he wrote his song on the back of an envelope, but envelopes hadn't been invented yet.
When Frank got off the boat, he made his way here. In 1814, there was a different and larger hotel called the India Queen, took up the whole block. He got a room in the hotel, but he couldn't sleep. He began to write, the influences of his favorite tune, the Anacreon in Heaven, running through his head.
That's it. That's the original manuscript Francis Scott Key penned that night at the India Queen Hotel. They have it here at the Maryland Historical Society. So the first thing in the morning, Frank headed here to the Nicholson home with his song in hand. Some say Frank showed the song to Skinner, and he was the one who had it published. But Roger Tawney, in a foreword of a book of Frank's poems that was published much later, mentioned specifically that it was Nicholson who wrote the description and brought it to a print shop. Whoever had it published, Frank's name never appeared on it, nor did it appear through the years of reprinting.
It's childish, but he was always trying to leave his mark, to be like a forefather. It was hard to even consider that his mark could be that song.
I thought he loved writing poetry and other creative things.
Of course, he did. But he never thought those qualities were of lasting importance.
One more question. Why did Frank make copies of his original document if he didn't think that song was important?
There are a lot of interesting things that came out of the War of 1812. Our victory in the two Indian Wars in the Northwest and the Southwest certainly opened the door to American expansion. We earned greater pride in the United States, respect abroad. We got a lot of symbols and sayings like "Don't give up the ship," "We've met the enemy and they are ours," "Uncle Sam," the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner song. That helped us forge an American identity, helped Americans understand who they were as a people and maybe where their nation was headed.
This program is made possible by Delaplane Foundation Incorporated of Frederick, Maryland, and by Mike and Marlene Young, George and Betty Delaplane, and production support provided by Shutter Punch Visual Effects. For more information about this program, including additional video, interactive maps, and more, please visit fskusa.org. You can also follow us on Facebook at FSKMPT and on Twitter at FSKey.